Guys, if you enjoy creepy stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. And also, tell where you are watching from. Night work suits me. I've been a courier for almost 5 years, running deliveries while the city sleeps. There's a kind of peace in it, less traffic, fewer people, just me and the quiet hum of the engine. Some nights are slow, others non-stop, but I always take one last job before heading home. That night I wish I hadn't. It was after 2 a.m., and I was parked near a closed gas station debating whether to call it quits. The streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional drunk stumbling home. My phone buzzed, a pickup request. The location was odd, an old cafe on the other side of town. I hesitated. Most businesses didn't run late-night deliveries, but I'd had stranger requests. I accepted. The drive was quiet, the buildings along the route dark and lifeless. As I pulled up to the cafe, my headlights swept over a faded sign, its paint chipping away. The place was closed, chairs stacked inside, not a soul in sight. No delivery bags by the door, no waiting staff, just one man. He stood at the edge of the sidewalk, half hidden in the dim glow of a flickering streetlight. His hoodie was pulled up, hands shoved deep into his pockets, body tense like a coiled spring. He shifted from foot to foot, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. I should have trusted my gut. Instead, I rolled down the window. "You waiting for a delivery?" He stepped forward, nodding once. His face was partially shadowed, but I could see stubble on his chin, the sharp cut of his cheekbones. He was thin, too thin, like he hadn't eaten in days. "You the driver?" he asked. His voice was rough, like a man who smoked too much or screamed too often. "Yeah," I replied. "You got a package?" For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he opened the back door and slid inside. That was when I realized something was wrong. Now, I've done plenty of package runs where someone hands off the goods and disappears, but this wasn't standard. The job request didn't mention a passenger. My stomach twisted, but I was already in too deep. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at the mirror. "Just drive." "I'll tell you where." I hesitated, fingers tightening on the wheel. Something about him felt off, not just his jittery movements, but the way he spoke, like his mind was racing ahead of his words. Still, I pulled away from the curb. For the first few blocks, he said nothing. Most people scroll their phones or look out the window. Not him. He just stared, right at me, through the rearview mirror, unblinking. I tried to focus on the road, but every now and then, our eyes would meet. He had this expression, like he was sizing me up, like he was deciding something. I swallowed hard and reached for the radio, desperate to fill the silence. The second the music started, he snapped. "Turn it off." His voice was sharper this time, and I jumped slightly, nearly jerking the wheel. Without a word, I clicked it off. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Then finally, he spoke. "You ever pick up someone you shouldn't have?" The question sent a shiver down my spine. I forced a chuckle, trying to keep things light. "Hope not." He didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned back, muttering something under his breath. I caught a few words, something about trust, about danger. Then he started talking. Rambling, really. Said he used to be a driver like me, but he quit after some punks messed with his car. His voice was slow, deliberate, slurred in places. I couldn't make out all of it, but I noticed one thing. He was smiling, and it wasn't the kind of smile that put you at ease. "It's funny," he murmured. "How much trust you put in someone sitting right behind you." I felt my throat go dry. My grip on the wheel tightened. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I kept my face neutral. I didn't want him to know I was scared. The GPS said we were 10 minutes away. It felt like 10 hours. Then, as if a switch flipped, he started apologizing. Not to me. "I didn't mean it," he whispered. "I didn't mean it." His voice cracked, and he ran his hands through his hair, tugging at the strands. "I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it. I stopped listening. My mind was racing. What hadn't he meant? What had he done? We were just minutes from the destination when he suddenly stiffened. His head snapped toward the window. "You missed the turn," he growled. I hadn't. The GPS was clear. "Pull over," he demanded. I hesitated. My hands were sweating against the steering wheel. Now. My heart hammered in my chest, but I did as he said. I just wanted him out of my car. As soon as I stopped, headlights flooded the street behind us. A patrol car. The man in my back seat went rigid. Then, slowly, he slouched down, shrinking into the shadows. I barely breathed as the cop car rolled past, its spotlight sweeping over the sidewalk. That was when I realized he didn't want to be seen. I kept my eyes forward, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to tell the officers something was wrong, but I didn't move. After what felt like an eternity, he lifted his head and murmured, "You got lucky." Then, before I could react, he threw open the door and vanished into the alley. For a long time, I just sat there, my heart pounding, my breath shaky. I didn't move until I was sure he was gone. A week later, I saw the news. A cafe had been robbed that same night, 2 blocks from where I picked him up. The owner had been attacked. I never reported it. I don't deal with cops, but I know what I saw. Now, when my gut tells me to drive away, I listen. I used to believe I was a city person. The hum of traffic, the neon glow of shop fronts, the endless murmur of conversation. It all felt like the heartbeat of something alive, something vast and comforting. I never thought I would leave it, until I had no choice. I won't get into the details of what happened, but one day, the noise stopped being background music and turned into a weapon. Every honk of a horn, every screech of tires, every distant shout scraped against my nerves like nails on glass. I started jumping at things that never bothered me before, doors slamming, the murmur of radios through thin apartment walls, even the clink of silverware in a restaurant. It got so bad that I couldn't function. My therapist gave it a name, phonophobia. I just called it hell. I needed silence. So I left. I found a listing for a small stone house in the middle of nowhere. It was old, built decades ago, tucked deep within the Irish countryside. No neighbors for miles, no roads leading directly to it, just a worn footpath through the moors. It sounded perfect. The listing claimed it was a place for those who seek solitude. That was exactly what I needed. The moment I arrived, I knew I had made the right choice. The house was sturdy, made of rough gray stone, with thick wooden beams and a massive hearth at its center. It smelled like damp earth and something older, something that had been waiting in the walls for a long time. But it was quiet, blessedly, beautifully quiet. The first few days were like a reset for my soul. I walked through the fields, let the wind wash over me, listened to nothing but the distant rustle of trees. For the first time in months, I could breathe. Then, a knock came at my door. It was late, near dusk. The house had no doorbell, and I hadn't seen another soul since arriving. When I opened the door, a man stood on my doorstep. He was old, not in a frail, withering way, but in the way mountains are old. His skin was weathered, his eyes sharp as flint. His clothes were rough and practical, thick wool, sturdy boots, like someone who belonged to the land itself. He held out a bundle wrapped in cloth. "You'll be needing this," he said. His voice was rough, like stones shifting against each other. I hesitated before taking it. The fabric was rough under my fingers, and when I unwrapped it, I found a lantern inside, a heavy iron thing, older than anything I had ever owned. "Oil's full," he said. "Keep it that way." I frowned. "I have electricity." He shook his head. "Keep it full." I let out a nervous laugh. "All right, thanks, I guess." The man didn't move. He just watched me for a moment, then said, "Lock your doors at night. Don't open them after sundown, and if you hear knocking..." His voice trailed off, as if reconsidering his words. Then he looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Don't answer." Then he turned and walked away, disappearing down the path before I could think of what to say. The whole encounter left me rattled, but I pushed it aside. People in small villages were eccentric, right? Maybe he was just trying to scare the newcomer. I set the lantern on the mantel and forgot about it. For the first week, everything was normal, peaceful. I started to believe I had finally found my escape. Then, the knocking began. It was soft at first. 3 gentle taps on the heavy wooden door. The first time, I dismissed it as the wind, but then it happened again, and again. Always 3 knocks, always after dark. I thought about what the old man had said, "Don't answer," and I didn't. But one night, Curiosity got the better of me. I had been sitting by the fire, half asleep with a book in my lap, when the knocks came again. 3 distinct raps against the wood. My breath caught in my throat. This time, I stood and approached the door, pressing my ear against it. Silence. I reached for the handle, and then, from the other side, another knock. This one wasn't soft. It was deliberate, loud enough to shake the door on its hinges. A slow, creeping chill worked its way up my spine. I turned the lock and stepped back. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided to visit the village. I needed to ask about the old man, about the house, about whatever the hell was knocking on my door. The town was small, just a cluster of stone buildings, a church, and a single pub. I found an elderly woman working in the general store, her hands lined with years of hard work. When I mentioned the house, her face changed. "You're staying up there?" she asked, her voice hushed. I nodded. "Why?" She set down the tin she was stocking and wiped her hands on her apron. "You shouldn't be." I waited for her to continue, but she just shook her head. "The man who gave you the lantern," I pressed. "Who is he?" Her expression darkened. "There's no man like that in the village." A cold knot tightened in my stomach. "That's not possible. He knocked on my door. He gave me the lantern. He warned me." She exhaled sharply. "If he warned you, you'd best listen." That was the last thing she said. I left with more questions than answers. That night, I lit the lantern. I didn't know why, but something in me knew it was the right thing to do. The moment the flame flickered to life, I felt safer. I kept it burning as I went to bed. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. The fire in the hearth had died down, leaving the room in flickering shadows. But that wasn't what woke me. It was the sound, a slow, rhythmic scraping. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat. The sound was coming from the window. From outside, something dragged against the glass. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then the knocking came. 3 sharp raps against the front door. And then the voice, low, whispering, "Let me in." I clenched my fists. The lantern beside me flickered wildly, but the flame held. Another knock. "Let me in." The scraping at the window grew frantic, nails against glass, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, silence. I stayed awake until dawn, the lantern burning beside me. By morning, the house felt different. I could feel it in my bones, the heavy stillness like something was waiting. I didn't stay to find out what. I packed my things and left. As I walked down the path for the last time, I passed the old man's lantern still sitting on the mantel. The flame inside it had burned out, or maybe something had blown it out. I never looked back, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear knocking, and I never, ever answer. My name is Jake, and my girlfriend Emily and I have been together for 3 years. We met as freshmen at the University of Washington, my dream school since I was a kid. Neither of us is from the West Coast. Emily is from Chicago, and I grew up in a small town outside of Detroit. I think that shared Midwest connection made us feel closer from the start. One of our favorite traditions is how we split Christmas between our families. Emily fits right in with my relatives, and at this point, they expect her to be there. Since her family's home is only a few hours from mine, we decided early on that we'd spend Christmas Eve with my family and then drive through the night to her house for Christmas Day. Before meeting her, I never realized that most families celebrate on Christmas Day instead of Christmas Eve. But honestly, my favorite part of the holiday isn't either. It's the long, quiet drive between our homes. It's something we both look forward to every year. The route we take isn't on a major highway. Instead, it's mostly back roads, passing through empty fields and quiet forests. Since we drive so late at night, we hardly ever see other cars. It feels like the whole world is asleep, and we're the only 2 people awake. It's peaceful in a way that's hard to explain. And every year, we blast our favorite music. Don't laugh, but we always listen to old school pop punk. Singing along together makes the drive even better, like we're completely in sync. This past Christmas Eve started out just like the others. After a fun evening with my family, we packed up the car around midnight and hit the road. Snow was falling lightly, and as expected, the roads were completely empty. With the heater on and music blasting, everything felt perfect, but that didn't last. What happened next is the most unsettling thing I've ever experienced. I was driving when my phone rang, cutting off the music. A little annoyed, I glanced down and saw an unknown number. Figuring it was just a scam call, I ignored it. Emily laughed, joking that telemarketers must be really dedicated to be calling on Christmas. We brushed it off and kept going. A few minutes later, my phone rang again. Same unknown number. I sighed and let it go to voicemail. Emily raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. I tilted my phone to show her the screen, and she just said, "That's weird." I tried to shake it off, but when my phone rang again 2 minutes later, I snapped. Annoyed, I grabbed it and answered, ready to tell whoever it was to stop calling. My sudden reaction startled Emily, but I didn't care. I was fed up. "Hello?" I said sharply. At first, there was only silence. Then, faint static crackled through the speaker. I was about to hang up when a man's voice spoke. "Hello, Jake." I nearly swerved off the road. My heart started pounding. I didn't recognize the voice. Before I could say anything, he started listing personal details, my full name, my address, things no stranger should know. Panic set in. My mind raced, trying to figure out how this was happening. I wanted to pull over, but my hands were frozen on the wheel. Instead, I forced myself to speak, keeping my voice steady. "What do you want?" The man paused for a moment. Then he said the words that made my blood run cold. "I'm not here for you. I'm here for Emily." Hearing my own name was unsettling, but hearing hers was much worse. I turned to look at her, and the fear in her eyes told me she was just as terrified as I was. I blurted out, "You have the wrong number. I don't know an Emily." The man let out a quiet chuckle. "She's sitting right next to you." That was it. My hands were shaking as I pulled the car over to the side of the road. I turned to Emily, about to say something, but before I could, she reached over and in one quick motion ended the call. I stared at her in shock. "Why did you do that?" I demanded. "That guy was threatening us. Why would you hang up?" She didn't answer. She just looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. I tried calling the number back. Once, twice, 3 times. Each time the call failed. Emily whispered, "Just drive." I hesitated, but eventually put the car in gear and pulled back onto the road. The silence between us was heavy. I kept glancing at her, my thoughts racing. "Why did you hang up?" I asked again. She shook her head. I was scared. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to be mad at her, but I understood. Part of me expected the number to call again, but after 10 minutes of nothing, it seemed unlikely. When I looked over at Emily, I saw tears in her eyes. "I don't feel safe," she admitted. I nodded, but something didn't sit right with me. I knew Emily. There had been small moments in our relationship, little white lies, half-truths, nothing serious, nothing that ever broke my trust completely. But now I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't telling me everything. The rest of the drive was silent. I didn't play the music again. Neither of us spoke. My mind kept circling the same questions. Who was that man? How did he know so much about me? Only our families knew about our drive that night, and I knew they would never pull something like this. When we finally pulled into Emily's driveway, I still didn't feel any better. It's been almost a month now, and I still don't have answers. We asked our families, and they weren't responsible. Emily swears she has no idea who it was. That leaves me with one terrifying possibility. Whoever called had sinister intentions. You might think I'm overreacting to a prank call, but I know this was more than that. No one outside our families even knew we were on that road that night. And now, every time my phone rings, I hold my breath, because I know he's going to call again. It's just a matter of time. These were today's 3 terrifying winter stories. Which one did you find the scariest? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed these stories, make sure to like and share. Stay tuned for tomorrow's video with more chilling tales.